One thing I love about working with people at the end of life is you can fall in love, and that's not a hazard. That's not a problem. You can just let that happen. That's a beautiful thing, and you're not going to be together for very long. When I'm working with patients who have an indefinite lifespan, I have to almost watch it. I don't say love very often because it can send odd signals, but when you're really at the end, there's a permissiveness that's really powerful.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today we have the honor of speaking with B.J. Miller, a renowned palliative care physician, author, and speaker. B.J. is a thought leader in the field of conscious dying. He's well known for his 2015 TED Talk, What Really Matters at the End of Life, which has been viewed over 10 million times. When he was a sophomore at Princeton University, B.J. experienced a tragic accident that resulted in the loss of 3 of his limbs. He followed a path in the medical field and eventually fell in love with palliative care while he was in residency. He's been helping patients and their families ever since. In this conversation, BJ shares his insights on the differences between palliative and hospice care, as well as the emotional and spiritual needs of patients facing terminal diagnoses. He also talks about his own experiences working with patients and their families, and how to help people come to terms with their own impending death, including how to help them become unstuck from a negative narrative. I found one of the most fascinating topics in this conversation to be the role of psychedelics in end-of-life care. BJ shares his thoughts on the recent Johns Hopkins study concerning psilocybin mushrooms and end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients, where up to 80% of participants reported significant reductions in anxiety and improved quality of life. As we wrap up the conversation, BJ shares his thoughts on how he sees palliative care evolving in the future, and what role he sees himself playing in that evolution. He also talks about how his online palliative care service, Mental Health, will free him up to do palliative care the way he wants to do it. This conversation took place live at Esalen on February 8th, 2023. I came out of this evening really understanding, possibly for the first time, how a thoughtful relationship with death can help us tap into our human potential and transcend our limits. So without further ado, let's dive into this thought-provoking conversation with B.J. Miller.
Yeah, thank you.
Check.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam. See you all. Thank you very much for coming.
So, BJ, could you talk a little bit about what led you down the path of palliative care?
I got injured in college in some pretty obvious ways. And that kind of tuned me into medicine, and then graduated in 93 and kind of... I had gotten very good at living in the moment by necessity. There was just enough to do to get through the day, and there was a sort of a feeling of rolling to a cliff's edge at graduation, and I really didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I wanted to work with these experiences, not pretend to put them behind me or overcome them, and that pointed me towards medicine. And I went into sort of medical training thinking either I won't be able to do it for physical reasons or intellectual reasons, and I'll stop, or I'll fall in love with it and it'll work out. And I sort of fell in love with it. It's a long answer to your question, Sam. Sorry, brother. I sort of fell in love with medicine, at least the idea of medicine. And we can talk all sorts about healthcare. But there's also this sort of almost inherent, necessary disillusionment that happens in medical training. And I was going to drop out. I thought I was going to go into rehab medicine, work with other folks with disabilities, and because that was the impulse, was to just work from these experiences more than like a love of medical science. So then I finally did a rotation in rehab medicine and really didn't like it. It was just for all sorts of reasons. And I was going to stop.
What did you not like about the rehabilitative medicine?
It was, the field, at least that time, and maybe it shifted, but it was very mechanical in nature. It was very, medicine is a beautiful thing, and it's also a very reductive thing, especially around disability and issues that aren't fixable. Medicine gets very unpoetic. And that, I was experiencing that. And for one, when I would do the work, like it was on the rotation, I'd always hear people kind of point to me, see, Johnny, if you stick to it, you too can be a doctor. I just feel like, I'm signing up to be like a poster child, not for one. And then the second was that I started to say it was just so mechanical. Like it wasn't about the existential issues or the philosophical or the spiritual issues were nowhere to be found. It was just about the angle of a joint. Anyway, for that reason, I just started that this is not for me. And I knew enough from my experience coming close to death that I wasn't going to just keep doing this just because what else am I going to do? So I wasn't going to sacrifice life to medicine. So then I was going to dump it. And then the dean talked me into doing an internship, the first postdoc year. And once you do your internship, you can get your license to practice as a GP. And so she said, do that. Better, then you can stop if you want. And I did that, and I ran into palliative care literally in the hallway of the hospital during my internship and fell in love with it instantly. I did a 2-week elective, and after the first day, I knew that's what I was going to do.
Mm. Would you be open to talking a little bit about the evolution, the personal evolution that you went through after your accident in college? Because I see you as this person, and I've listened to lots of interviews that you've done kind of in preparation for this talk, and you have a really positive, not Pollyanna, but a positive kind of useful outlook towards life. And I'm wondering about, you went through this experience, a near-death experience, and then, you were there, in the hospital, and you had to go through the process of, okay, I'm going to live my life. And I was wondering if you could just talk about your outlook and how that evolved.
Yeah, I grew up with a mom who had polio and post-polio syndrome and has been progressively disabled over the course of my life. When I was younger, she walked on crutches, and now she uses an electric wheelchair and sort of progressive neurological illness. But growing up with Mom, I was sort of tuned into disability rights issues, and I had inherited the understanding from her that disability is a word. It's a relative. It's a construct. It's basically a made-up notion, and that I knew that I deserved or something like that to be alive or something like that. That the world had a place for me, even if it didn't seem like it. So it was almost like I knew those to be the answers from her example. So it was sort of like I knew that, I kept an eye on that, and just kind of kept inducing myself to actually believing that. And I was very blessed with a lot of friends who, I got so much help. I was not alone in any way. And we talk about that, Sam. It was just beautiful watching people show up, and it took a while to let all that love in, but they love me, so I could take that on faith too, and then sort of pull myself towards that and fill in the space between until I could believe it. Something like that.
Yeah.
And so that went, sort of like the first 5 years were really kind of monumental, and one day after another, and kind of really ruthlessly, like when I'd bump up against something that seemed hard, which was a lot of the time, you'd just say, is it true that I can't do this? Is that really true? Or is it I'm tired, or I don't want to do it? And I just was really diligent and to the point of tedious. I would not let myself off that hook. And so, and then you get some momentum, and then you start, this body is no longer this thing that's lacking something. It's just what you have, and you're working with it. And you have enough water under the bridge to prove it to yourself. And bit by bit, you kind of embody yourself again. And that happened. And like I say, about 5 years time or so.
Were you on track to go to medical school and
No.
What were you interested in?
I don't know. I was lucky, I was very lucky. Grew up, I had a family that cared about me and put me through schools, and, I had a lot going for me. And all I knew, so I landed at a place like Princeton, ridiculously wonderful buffet of knowledge and interest and beauty. And I was very much in the liberal arts mode. I wasn't pressured to know what to do with my life, and I took that. I didn't know. And I was just studying things because they interested me and trying to develop my brain. And and other organs, and it was really wonderful, and it was very fortunate, and it allowed me to sit in some stew and actually choose something. So no, I don't know what I was going to do, Sam. I probably would have defaulted to some silly job in finance, like, some management thing like my dad did or something if I didn't find anything else. Mm-hmm. But actually, when I say I'm not sure I believe that. I was teetering well before the accident about that path. But I guess the answer is, who knows? I really don't know. And in some ways, how nice. It's not like I was heading there and then all that got cut off and I couldn't be this thing I'd always dreamed of being, and then I had to go this consolation prize route. That was never really the story.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about palliative care. I mean, what you say that like rehabilitative care, it wasn't really the thing for you. Then you stumble into palliative care, and why did that pique your interest?
Well, for one, the rest of medicine is such a dramatic foil. You're so aware. A typical course of medical training is you come in with these ideals and a lot of compassion. And you want to be with other people. You go through such lengths just in order to be of service. It's a very filled with beautiful people wanting to do lovely things. It's great. But like I mentioned earlier, there's a disillusionment of the facts of what practicing medicine is like. Mm. And so with that harsh background and this objectification that always happens and reducing people to their body parts, and even as you're doing it, so much is getting lopped off. So you kind of either acculturate and buy into that, or you kind of hold on to some suspicion. And the suspicious route is a little painful because you're at odds with what you're doing much of the time. So anyway, with that harsh backdrop, and with the idea of dumping medicine right around the corner, I was really going to dump it. That allowed me, one, to be free. I wasn't stuck, so I could actually choose. It wasn't a desperate act. And I also was fresh with the evidence that the other route was no good, not for me, and I didn't know I wouldn't be able to function in that. So in palliative care, when you meet these people who are not trying to fix you, they're not looking at you as an object to put back together, not treating you as broken. Mm. They're treating you as just living this is what happens to a body. This is life. It's not, it's an importantly different frame, or it can be. And the subjective sense is totally, is welcome. Because of course everything's subjective. You can't wash an experience through your person and not, it is the truth. There's a truth to subjectivity. And that wasn't a problem in palliative care, whereas in the rest of medicine it's a problem. So it's this immediate feeling of relief. And you don't have to know all the answers. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to posture. You show up as a human being, and you can lend some other skills to that. At least this is the kind of palliative care I was taught and what I witnessed those early days.
Let me ask you just a point of clarification. Could you elaborate on the differences between palliative care and hospice care?
Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you, Sam. Because there's a lot of confusion around this, and people suffer unnecessarily because of it. So palliative care is simply just the interdisciplinary pursuit of quality of life, essentially. And our charge, the thing we respond to, medicine, you always have to frame it around a problem. And the problem we respond to is suffering, which, as we know, is like a very human experience. It's not an abnormal experience. In fact, it would be very abnormal to find your way through life and not suffer. Anyway, so pursuing quality of life and mitigating suffering is what palliative care is about. And what a beautiful, that's a philosophy we could all live by. That's practically a religion. And so that really lit up as a way of life. And so that doing my job was aligned with learning things about life, which was aligned with making sense of my own experience, which was aligned with me showing up as a human being, completely aware of his own suffering. And it set up a beautiful little loop that is very constructive and life-affirming if you choose it, if you create it that way, and if you practice it that way. And that's really kind of how it's played out. So I don't have to separate, am I working on somebody else or on myself? Those two things are aligned.
So you worked at the Zen Hospice Project. I think it's now called the Zen Caregiving Project for many years. I'd love to hear about that and like kind of, I'd love for you to talk about the state that people can get into when they receive a terminal diagnosis. What generally happens?
Well, I'm smiling not because of that question, but because I just realized I didn't answer your previous question at all about hospice versus palliative care. But maybe we'll circle back, man. Jeez. So can you rephrase it again? Sam, can you say it again?
Sure. I mean, talk to me about working at the Zen Hospice Project. How did that come about? And, what did you encounter?
Yeah. So Zen Hospice Project, as you said, it's now Zen Caregiving Project. It's been in existence since the late 80s. It's a really magical organization in a lot of ways. And coming from UCSF and this academic medicine world, I was very attracted to, here was a place that did the kind of care I was interested in, but did it from a basis of a spiritual basis versus a medical science basis. And what an interesting, bless you, what an interesting way, leading edge, that was lit up for me as something really powerful. And the second was the fact that it had a bricks and mortar, had a house. And I really feel there is this underdeveloped aesthetic piece that could happen in care. And it's not lost on most patients that hospitals are incredibly ugly places and they're assaulting to the senses. And here was this old Victorian in San Francisco, and the house itself was part of the care. It was beautiful. So anyway, that's what took me there. And then working there was, it was an odd experience. We could talk on this one for hours too. There's a culture the place wasn't quite sure, and this is me translating it, okay? Take everything with a grain of salt. But it seemed like it was a secular organization that seemed conflicted. Was it really secular, or was that just trying to attract more people? Was it trying to be Buddhist? Was it really open to everybody? There was also a lot of antipathy towards medical science that was well deserved in the 1980s in the Bay Area. I'm referencing AIDS and HIV and how that was treated. So all this backstory to that place, and made me feel very. So one tributary we could talk about, Sam, is that whole experience of the culture of that place and working there. But I think you're getting at your question is probably more about what was it like to sort of be in a home and live with people who are really on life's edge.
Yeah.
And you can say the same of a hospital in some ways, but you don't get to the person in the same way in that setting as you do in a little Victorian. With a kitchen making beautiful smelling things and families milling around and animals walking around. And so what I think finally a short answer to your question is it felt like life. It felt like life. It felt like life in concentrate. It felt like all of life concentrated here with an excuse to dump the shame, with an excuse to dump guilty feelings, with a real excuse to love people. And I don't say that lightly, but it is an amazing thing. One thing I love about working with people at the end of life is you can fall in love, and that's not a hazard. That's not a problem. You can just let that happen. That's a beautiful thing, and you're not going to be together for very long. So when I'm working with patients who have an indefinite lifespan, I have to almost watch it. I don't say love very often because it can send odd signals. But when you're really at the end, can be a permissiveness that's really powerful.
Man, that's beautiful.
I really felt that there.
Oh, that is so beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank them.
In terms of the work that you do in a place like hospice or with palliative care in general, how much of your job is being psychiatrist, or how much of the job is in the mind?
A ton. A lot. A lot. It also depends. I mean, there are sort of schools of thought within palliative care. You will meet some colleagues who translate palliative care to mean symptom management.
Yeah.
And, which oftentimes you're numbing someone out or, trying to turn down the noise of symptoms, which is an absolutely wonderful pursuit. But from the school of palliative care I come from, that's sort of step one. You turn down the noise of symptoms so that you can be present with your life, so that you can tune into the rest of things besides pain, so you can be present for what time you have. That's really the much bigger work. And so that kind of gets to your question. That's where a lot of the psychology is playing out, and trying to be with someone so that they get right with themselves before they go and appreciate life while they still have it, that, you're bumping up against watching people kind of come to terms with all they can't control, which for most of us is that's some pretty tricky math. And so, we are constantly working with the mind. And more specifically, it's sort of how it's like a framing issue. You can work with people so that they can understand their experience in a relative way, in a framed way. Like, for myself, am I just horribly unlucky? I've lost 3 limbs, poor guy, right? Or am I super lucky that I have this one limb that I happen to be right-handed and they make beautiful prostheses? Am I lucky or am I unlucky? Which is it? And the answer is both. And a lot of people force themselves into they don't give themselves, I don't know what the word is, the respect or the space to feel all the feelings while they still have them. That was a lesson at the end of life for me when I was close to it. I was almost grateful to feel pain. Like, oh my God, I can feel anything. I'm here to feel something. It is really very often this framing exercise, which for me is the boiled down answer to your question of the psychology at work and helping people craft a worldview in which they still belong. Because the world sends a lot of signals to sick people, to old people, to disabled people that this isn't really a place for you. So you have to reframe continuously. And there's so much loneliness in the world. And it's so interesting that the tie that binds a lot of us is the fact that we know loneliness. That becomes the point of contact. And so you start making these connections in this work. And to my mind, a lot of that is a psychological enterprise.
I just lost my mom about a month ago. It still hurts. But I would love for you to discuss the importance of building relationships with the families of the people who are going to die. How does that play into hospice care?
In a big way. And thank you for sharing that, Sam. This subject can get real abstract if we're not careful, and that's a little bit of a problem. This is a very real subject once we turn attention to it. So thank you for bringing your family in here.
Yeah.
What was your mom's name?
Maxine.
Well, so in answer to your question, families play a huge piece of in the role. I mean, technically, if you were to read the definition of hospice and palliative medicine, you would see that the unit of care is the patient and their family, and which is an explicit acknowledgement that we don't exist we're not this autonomous in a vacuum thing. There is no independent person on this planet, and palliative care acknowledges that explicitly. So officially the family's part of it, and in practice, that's what kind of gets at one of the reasons why we started mental health was because, the field says families are welcome, but the way healthcare is wired, the spouse of a patient of mine can't set an appointment with me in the clinic because they're not the patient. So there's a little bit of lip service to the idea of a family. So we pulled ourselves out of the healthcare structure in part to make a lot of space for the family. And when I say family, I mean by choice or by blood, But back to your question, really it's just the acknowledgement that we exist in relationship. And even if I'm trying to address your suffering, there's no way I can honestly do that without taking into your account your relationships. That's how you experience your life.
Yeah.
So it has to be.
What about the emotional impact on you? What is that like working in the field of living and dying?
For all the reasons we're saying, in some ways it's so awesome. Because the things that otherwise you might just get to daydream about or think about when you look out at the sunset here, or, when a lot of us with daily lives that pull us away from these kinds of thoughts and questions, this is my job. I get to hang out with these questions like this and play around with thoughts like this. So in some ways it's really wonderful. And like we were saying earlier, that alignment between the personal and the professional and self and other and the individual and the collective, these are all in this stew. So in so many ways, it's awesome. And then there's also the realities of practicing this and how do you make a living and charging people for things that you feel weird charging for. And, there's all sorts of trickiness to it as a practice, as a business. But I think the biggest way, and I was thinking about this a lot recently, I don't know, I circle through this, what I'm about to say, which is I find myself sometimes really kind of out of step with a lot of daily life stuff, with people in daily life stuff. And sometimes myself included, I'll feel out of step with myself for wanting to watch TV or I don't know if there's, I'll think of a better example. But the point is like, in this frame, like we're talking, this big existential frame of connection and poignancy and everything matters, that's a really exquisitely tender, nuanced, subtle, sensitive place. And then you step out in this world that's really not wired for sensitivity, right, where it's almost that is a liability. So toggling between these experiences or these backdrops, I find it kind of exhausting. And sometimes I'm still in one world when I'm talking to someone in another world. And sometimes I'm not really present with my friends in this way. I'm thinking about the patient. And sometimes the squeaky wheels get my grease. Someone's got to be really suffering for me to go to them. And my friends and family will get short shrift, or I will. So there's some challenges to it for sure. I don't think I will do this work forever for that reason.
Yeah.
I think you hang out in this distorted field or working with people who are in this array of distortion as they're kind of discombobulating and it's powerful and I'm learning so much from it. And at some point it's consuming, especially if you're in a role to be the person that people are looking to somehow make this thing better. So I don't think I'll do it forever for this reason.
Yeah. How about spirituality? I have learned that you're an agnostic. I'm just wondering if being around death and dying professionally for many years, has it influenced your spirituality?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of like the aesthetic around spirituality is often what bothers me more than, it's sort of like there's a look and there's a language and there's a head tilt sometimes that goes with it all that pulls me away from the guts of it. And so I get sometimes a little distracted by the trappings or the language of spirituality. But that was also me kind of trying to be a little intellectual and smarter than somebody or something like that. And I finally have, now I'm 50, almost 52, and I think I'm letting myself be spiritual. No, that's not quite right. I'm letting myself acknowledge spirituality in a newer way, and I'm not pecking at it, which is, I think that's good news. It's allowed me to actually talk about it and love it and be with it, and that has been really powerful. And it's also pulled me towards this really, like they were saying, agnostic, like literally just the joys of not knowing and mystery and just not needing to solve things. It's such a relief. There's a real innocence in there, and I love, love, love that. And I also, speaking of the word, I finally had to define it for myself so I could use the word and mean it. And I think for me, it's sort of spirituality. I guess it's like a sense of connection that you can't see or prove. That I can't prove that everything's connected. But I sure can sense that truth. And I think a spiritual crisis is when people are cut off from that connection, and that shows up in my line of work pretty commonly.
Being cut off from connection.
Yeah. Because
one is facing the end.
Yeah. And because their sense of self is disintegrating, their identity. These are, there's many reactions to death, but I'm just in general, people's identities are often shaken, and you can be aware, so hyper aware of all the sense of loss, and therefore all the things that aren't happening, And so, that discombobulation is a big part of the job. It's what you're kind of guiding folks through. And you also know that even as they're feeling disconnected from who they used to be, who they maybe wish they were, and they're pre-grieving the sense that maybe they're going to be cut off from life altogether when they die, the grand disconnection. So, that's all happening. And so, but the beautiful thing is, so yes, spiritual sort of strife is all over it. And then there's this lovely thing is if you can hold that discombobulation, make some room for it so they get to know it belongs to, then people can let go of, by force or by choice, all the things that they are actually losing and start to feel the thing that actually is still there. And that's a very beautiful transition to watch. So I don't know too often how many people, most people by the time they get to their death have, I don't know if the word's not solved that spiritual disconnection, but it's been revealed to them that they can't lose it or something like that.
Do you find that you have to help people navigate through regret?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. And in a lot of the work, if you get to hang out with folks upstream of death, I will often use regret avoidance as how do we shape our future. Make choices now that you're not going to regret or going to minimize regret. And along the way, learn to realize you're going to find something to regret. So also learn to live with regret, not just minimize it. So there's a lot of work that happens around that issue of regret.
You mentioned upstream of death. What does that mean?
Well,
is that a couple
Well, I just mean let's just say you have a diagnosis of some sort of cancer that you can live for many years with.
Okay,
that's what I mean. That temporally you're not quite at death's door.
That almost sounds harder.
You're right on about that, Sam. You're very right. And this is actually some good news for those of us who may fear death or have some concern about it. Most of that fearing death is something that living people do. When death is this abstract thing that might come get you tonight or tomorrow, that, folks who are actually dying, especially if they've got some love and support around them, a lot of that fear goes away. A lot of the regret just melts into, of course I got regret. I've got sorrow. I've got joy. I've got all this stuff. But wait a second. Now, what was your question? Did I just ramble off?
No, I think that was good. Yeah.
Okay, brother.
Let's talk a little bit about the end-of-life anxiety and maybe foray into this psychedelics question, because I know there's been at least one good study, I think it was from Johns Hopkins, about psychedelic mushrooms easing end-of-life anxiety. Where do you come out on this?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard not to be thrilled about the return to psychedelic work. A lot of us are now more and more aware of the history, sort of modern psychiatry history, where there's some amazing data out of the 50s and 60s and the political history of why this whole thing got shut down. And of course, that's just the medical Western view. A lot of these chemicals substances have been around for eons, and people have been so. Anyway, there's a lot to be interested in, and there's a lot to love about the current data. I mean, it's stunning. I mean, we're talking, some of the hardest things we do in palliative care is beyond the symptom management. How do you get someone in touch with with meaning, and how do you help someone actually feel connected, not just intellectually? We're all related. Yeah. But I mean, feel it. So getting out of the head and into the body, that sort of discombobulation process, kind of practicing falling apart. And that can turn into instead of falling, you're kind of surfing it. You're rolling with it, and you're moving with your life. That's really some gorgeous stuff that can happen with psychedelics that otherwise just sound like a cool story, but you're not going to have the visceral I know I'm connected to everything. I know I'm in this world. I can't possibly leave this universe. That is not a thought anymore. If you do some guided work with psychedelics, you can come away knowing that in your bones, quite literally. And for someone who's coming to the end of their days in this body, you can imagine the poignancy of that feeling. That's huge. And in the medical world, if we could, if that were if we could bottle that, if the drug companies could, that would, this would be $10 zillion a pill, and it would be all the talk, So these are impacts, these are effects that are enormous and seem durable. And let's be thoughtful too. Let's be careful to learn as we go, and not just throw ourselves willy-nilly into these experiences, and let's respect these chemicals. And let's not confuse the chemical with the effect we're trying to achieve. I don't think you need to be altered to feel connected to the cosmos. So there's a lot to do to frame these drugs well, these experiences well, and thoughtfully. But once within that sort of thoughtful space, I'm very bullish. I just think this is a sort of a new day. And the alternative before, Sam, was if you came to me and you had, death anxiety, I can't tell you what it's like to be dead. What can I say to you? We can talk about those fears. I can help you feel not alone. I can give you Valium, put a wet blanket on your nervous system, so, treat your anxiety that way. I can kind of gork you out with pain medicine, but that's very different from, you're worried about meaninglessness. Let me give you meaning. That is that is just a whole other deal, and it's thrilling to think that that's an increasingly accessible.
Let's talk about the future of palliative care. How do you see palliative care evolving? And talk to me about mental health, the work that you're doing there, please.
Yeah. Shouldn't we all expect that our doctors care about our suffering and want us to not hurt unnecessarily? Wouldn't we all expect that our doctors want to participate in us for having a meaningful life, et cetera? Why is palliative care a specialty? Isn't all of medicine sort of trying to do this? Shouldn't it be? And of course, the answer is no, it's not. And so that's why this field had to come along as a little bit of a corrective to nudge healthcare back to actually care. And so, one cool thought would be that maybe someday this little field goes away. It doesn't need to exist anymore. So I guess I'm saying two things. One is to realize this as a philosophy and explode it and make everyone feel welcome into this conversation, not just doctors and nurses. And the other is to make it so diffuse that it ceases to be this special exotic thing and can go away as a subspecialty. I love that story. So I think we're participating in that happening. But obviously I feel strongly like I ultimately had to leave UCSF and pull mental health out of the medical model. There's too much momentum. There's too much stuff pulling you into a 15-minute encounter, a reduced notion of life. There's only so much work that can be done inside the walls of healthcare, and so finally felt the need to pull it out, and so that's what we did.
So, what do clients do, kind of under your care at Mental Health?
So, mental health, METTLE, like metal, your inner strength, which I love that word. I'm not teaching someone how to be strong. I'm being with them so they can realize they're strong or something like that. So anyway, mental health, we pulled out of medicine so you don't need a referral. Anyone can just call us up. It's almost like a hotline. Schedule an hour with us and talk about just about anything. And essentially it's just a safe place to fall apart. And we started in the pandemic because there was obviously a need for it. So that's what we do. And most of our clients are actually caregivers. 60% are caregivers. As we were saying earlier, it's hard to find your place as a caregiver. You're always considered in service to another person. Your identity is sort of framed around your care to somebody else. But what about your needs? So people come to us dealing with grief, questions around grief. People come to us with help navigating healthcare, communicating with their doctors or their family. trying to make difficult medical decisions. Also, just like I was saying earlier, a safe place to confess and fall apart and say things that are hard to say and know that you'll be heard with someone who has no agenda. It's kind of that simple.
That's great. All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the floor for a little Q&A. Esalen is predicated around this notion of human potential, this idea that we're all walking around in a state of untapped capabilities, but given the right environment, the right teachings, the right setting, this place, we can become kind of transcendent. How do you feel like a thoughtful relationship with death can dovetail with a life that is rich in human potential?
I not only think it can, I think it has to. To me, I think we're all, one way or another, I'm trying to love reality. I want to love my life. I want to love what exists, not what might exist. Or I want to love reality. And reality seems to include this thing called death. And reality seems to include suffering and loss. And you can try to avoid them. And I recommend avoiding them to some degree. But at some point, it will catch up with you. And can you imagine, they make movies about people who don't die. They're all zombies. And, there's something, and it's also true. I'll just ask you guys, I love asking this question. How many people here, if you could hit a button and live forever, how many of you guys would hit that button? Isn't that fucking okay, one or two.
Yeah.
Very brave. Very brave. But isn't that fascinating? We're all talking about death like it's this terrible thing that no one wants to do, but actually, it kind of works. And, and there's something lovely about it. You can't fail at it. You can't screw it up. You will get there. And there's something really and in a way, again, that sort of word, you're innocent. There's nothing wrong with you for dying. That is just, so, yeah. What were we talking about? What was the question again? Jeez, man, I'm sorry, Sam. I can't recall the question. Bless you.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. So let's open it up to the floor. Casey's got a microphone. Has anybody got something they'd like to ask Dr. Miller?
Hi, thanks. I have a question, and it's in part informed by my mom, who's losing her mental, faculties. And so how do you do that kind of work to help folks restore sense of meaning when their own presence, is an ability to track and things is declining?
Yeah, it's a doozy, as you know. I mean, and it's not easy, period. One answer to your question, a response maybe answers a little hard, a little strong, because so much of it is managing this discombobulation, managing the loss, and guiding a landing. It feel that way to me anyway. And we're talking one way or another, the discombobulation can happen quickly in life or over time. And dementia is a particular version that happens very slowly and affects, as you know, the sense of who they are in the world. And things like purpose can be elusive. And I think besides sort of naming that and normalizing that, what has felt like a great relief to some folks I've worked with is to realize meaning and purpose, those are really powerful forces. If you're lucky enough to find a sense of purpose, it's awesome, wonderful. The point here, I think, is that there's a world beyond purpose. There can be. And for me, it's sort of the aesthetic realm, the world of the senses. It doesn't need a story. Purpose tends to need a story, a narrative. I exist to do this. It kind of often comes with words, and it can get up in your mind. Whereas if you're really just gunning to have a sensation, well, practically anyone can feel something. And you don't need to have the intellectual piece then to spin it into a story about why it's important or what it does for you or blah, blah, blah. That's nice if you can get it. But my point here is there's a whole big, wide, lush valley on the far side of that intellect. And I don't mean to, glorify what can be really difficult. But my comments are partly geared towards sort of systems issues. Can we as a society sort of pride can we get beyond our utilitarian thinking, this purpose thing? You know, can we exist for its own sake? Do things for their own, feel something for its own sake? So if I sound critical, certainly don't mean that of you. It's more like, can we kind of create a world where people are safe to lose their mind? Because you're going to lose your mind either way. So, but personally, I do think gearing towards the truth of just the experience of this, of the sense in real time is as something of an answer to your question.
You started to touch on it again with the aesthetics. I'm really curious about what you mean by aesthetics, because I'm kind of fascinated by that. And there seems to be a sensory component, but then I'm wondering also about beauty and
Yeah, so this is my favorite subject of all. I just think this is so underdeveloped as a therapeutic domain, all sorts of stuff. So what I mean by the aesthetic is really sort of two criteria. One is that it is a sensory mediated experience, that involves feeling. And that's literally what the word means. It kicks you into the world of the senses and therefore the world of experience. And the second criterion is for its own sakeness. That, at least my own understanding of it, that was a sort of philosophical notion. If you want to read up on Kant, this came out of him. I don't know, there's all this historical sort of lineage. But that second piece of the puzzle seems really, really key to me. Something existing for its own sake. Doesn't need to be a means to an end. Means and the ends come together. Again, it's instantaneous. You don't need time. So if we're worried about death coming, you don't need time to have a feeling. And you don't need intellect to have the feeling. And it justifies itself. Art for its own sake, being for its own sake. So that self-containment is so elegant and ultimately, therefore, so accessible. And that's my answer to the question about the aesthetic. Sensory, mediated by the senses, and has a potency for its own sake. It may also play into a utilitarian thing. It might have that life too. But first and foremost, it has its own poignancy for its own sake.
You talked a little bit about how to live life in a way to minimize regret. And I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah. So thanks for the question. Because, first two steps, at least. One is, figure out what you might regret. Like be able to imagine yourself in situations and be in tune with yourself to know when you've actually regret something. Sometimes we won't give ourselves that feeling. It feels lowly, like jealousy or something, or we won't acknowledge it. So first is to kind of just feel it. And so once you're in tune with yourself and kind of comes with self-awareness, then you start making decisions that are right for you. And this is another aesthetic thing. How do you know something's right for you? Well, it often comes with a feeling. You could say intuition is probably an aesthetic experience, a gut feeling, So part of the work for mitigating regret would be getting in tune with yourself so you know when you're crossing lines you wish you wouldn't cross. So that's a huge piece of it. And the other piece, of course, would be just processing the inevitability of regret so they don't stack up, That's a huge piece of the puzzle. And for me, that kind of goes with that enter grief, which is a way to acknowledge the loss, acknowledge you wish it were otherwise, be true to that, and honor that. And then if you hang in there, you start seeing what you still have, and you can keep moving. And in that way, you're done with that regret to some degree. Be clean, and that word can be a little charged, but otherwise we start snowballing, and by the time we get more than a couple years on the planet, we're just like this ball of twine with hairs and stuff stuck to it. It's not pleasant. So mitigating regret is, again, making decisions that are in tune with yourself. First, you got to get in tune with yourself. Second is giving yourself forgiveness to know that you're going to regret something otherwise, and make room for regrets too.
I have a question about, I forget the name of the legislation in California, the End of Life Act. And I just saw this very, very beautiful film called Last Flight Home. I'm not sure if you've seen it. That was shortlisted for the Academy Awards this year, and it's about the filmmaker's father's decision to end his life. Mm-hmm. And at the time that she made the film, there was the 14-day or 15-day countdown. Mm-hmm. And, throughout the course of the film, you see this man and his family coming to terms with this decision and his resignation to end his life. Mm. But you see, part of it's motivated by guilt about what he's put his caregiver wife through for decades, and part of it is his own suffering. And so my question back to you is, having, I'm sure, navigated this many times, like, how do you help somebody, take advantage of that legislation if they can, because you have to be of sound mind, right? Yeah. And be able to physically take it.
You got it.
Like, how do you navigate, like, the balance between relieving, from a compassionate standpoint, relieving their pain, but helping them potentially, wearing your psychiatrist hat or psychologist hat, get to a place where they're ready to pass.
Yeah.
I imagine that's a very complicated stew.
You're right. Yeah.
I'm curious how you've navigated that and how you navigate that.
Yeah, thank you. I this is a very juicy topic, a big question. So guys, what she's referencing is the law since 2016 in California, the End of Life Options Act, EOLOA. And that was based on the Oregon law from the 90s. It was the first state to legalize hastening one's death. It used to be called physician-assisted suicide. That word suicide rubs people in the wrong way, in important ways, importantly different. It feels importantly different, and that came with baggage, so they dropped the word physician-assisted suicide, and now you hear references medical aid in dying, or medically assisted death, or assisted death. So the law basically states, and I'm just using your question as an excuse to kind of set the table a little bit, because it's an important thing to be aware of. You have to be of sound mind. Capacity is the word in medicine. You have to be able to show insight into your situation, because you can imagine if someone's fluidly delirious or don't know where they are, that it'd be pretty hard to follow their wish to end their life. So have to be of sound mind. Then you have to get two doctors to sign off, and there used to be a 15-day waiting period in between the two. You state your wishes in writing and in person, 15 days apart, to make sure it was an impulsive decision, to make sure, and you're interviewed without family around to make sure there wasn't coercion. All these safeguards to the law. And as you also mentioned, you have to ingest. So if you go through the process and a doctor writes you a prescription for a lethal dose of medicine, then it's up to you. In this country, euthanasia is when, like, a doctor would inject you, end your life in that moment. That is only legal in some states' prison systems. So in this country, so they'll give you your prescription. You go get the medicine, and then you decide if and when you want to take it. And one of the things that's interesting is a lot of people get the prescription, don't end up using it. And one of the lessons there is thought to be, well, then it's just, it's kind of nice to know you have a parachute in the medicine chest. If shit gets too hard, I'm out, I can get out of here. And that's itself therapeutic, So that's a big piece of this. So anyway, that's sort of the basics of the law. In the last couple of years, they shortened the waiting period down to a few days, I think 72 hours. And also you have to have a terminal diagnosis. So death has to be coming soon anyway to make this all palatable for the American legislation and sort of mentality. So that's the law. Working with people who are interested in hastening their own death, to your question, is, a lot of the job as it's legislated is for me to make sure that, like I said earlier, that's their decision. Are they depressed? Is this depression talking? Because then I should treat your depression. Are you wanting to die because you're in horrible pain and no one's really giving you pain meds? Well, then I should give you pain meds, and let's see if so there's all this, it's this last resort thing. But if I'm honest, the families I've worked with, and so you go down that list and you make sure all these things line up. But to a person, the people I've worked with who've actually taken the drug, importantly, it's not, at least in my experience, it hasn't played out as this flight from suffering or flight from misery, where life has just gotten so horrible that even death is preferable. That's the kind of frame. But in fact, what a lot of people are doing is it's not a flight from suffering as much as it's a move towards a meaningful act for some people that they see. Sometimes it's a little bit of like, okay, I'm like, I'm a quit before getting fired kind of a thing, So sometimes, sometimes it's just like, no, my body, my life, I'm going to say when it's my time. And then you can control the experience in some way with who's around and the people. And, so in my experience, back to your question, if people make it through this process with me or any doctor who's doing it, and they're finally honest and they don't have to, there's no theater around them proving misery enough for me to write the prescription, it very often flushes into a very beautiful, meaningful act. And the last thing to note about it, and again, this is just my experiences, I've also noticed the families who have gone through this process. A lot of us worried that it would further complicate grief because the idea that someone whom you love would choose to leave when on some level they still could be here and they want to leave, that can be a real head scratcher for a lot of us. But what's been interesting is to note how in these handful of people I've been with, the family seem to have an easier time of grief. In some ways, maybe they pre-grieved with the person while they were still alive, Yeah. Anyway, that's just an observation. I can't tell you why that is the case. But did I answer your question somewhere in there? Okay. Yeah.
I'm curious to know how working with this patient population, working around death, has informed sort of your day-to-day practices and how you've become who you are today.
Well, it's so, one of the good fortunes about this work is you get to live, you have vicarious experiences all the time. I might have all these reminders to appreciate what I have while I have it. And that phrase comes up for me a lot. I think a lot of us are pretty good at appreciating something once we've lost it. So I have all these people reminding me every day. So it can be this force to encourage you to live your life, to really live your life, And for me, that means, like we've been saying, feel all the feelings. It's not just a positive, head towards positive. It's a welcoming all of it in some level and being true to myself and knowing that it's all got to go anyway. So therefore, why don't I play with it? Why don't I love it, including the stuff that's hard? It's almost like an intrapersonal diversity. If you can, all the little nooks and crannies in you, if you actually welcome those little guys hanging out in the crevices somewhere, and bring those into you're reminded to be all that you are. And you're a little less likely to be ashamed of yourself because you know that that's the wrong answer. You've got people proving it to you who are actually closer to death than you, showing you, and it also helps you be true to, it's helped me learn how to grieve, which has been a very powerful force. So these are all the ways that this work can be very enriching, and it's gorgeous. And it can all be way too much. And sometimes you got to put down and go out in the woods and play with your dog and do all that stuff too, which is also part of what my patients are reminding me to do too. So, yeah.
Hi. So I actually work in the ER as a PA, and I feel like I deal with a lot of sudden death with people who don't have a lot of palliative care around. And I work in a really underserved ER, so we don't even have a social worker on staff to sit with the families after. So oftentimes we're left, it's the ER, you have other things to do. And I think in general, it feels shorted by everyone in that situation. So I was wondering if there was anything that you would recommend to allow the grief to happen in that container.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. And thank you for what you're doing, too, especially these days. I know your job to be very hard and very needed. So one thing and there are actually cool little studies about this, is sometimes, when I was working in hospitals, you just don't feel like you have time to grieve or time to acknowledge this or that. It feels like being asked to do something impossible. One realization is that it really, how the Greeks had a couple different notions of time. One was the accumulation of minutes, and the other one had something to do with moments. It wasn't a matter of numbers of seconds. It was a qualitative thing. And that distinction has been very helpful. So we know this. So if you sit down with a patient at the bedside versus hovering over them, if you introduce yourself, these are simple ways that this humanism actually transpires, and it doesn't take much time. Similarly, if there's a loss or a death or there's just pure emotion coming out, sitting down with that person, taking their hand, often touch is so friggin' magical. Take their hand and spend maybe 12 seconds saying, I hear you, I feel you, I'm so sorry, whatever you got to say. This place is crazy and I can't stay here for long, but I'm not going to forget you. Something like that takes a couple seconds. It will be so good for them and it'll be so good for you. And if there's time permitting beyond that, closing the curtain, spending maybe a couple minutes. And also with your peers back in the break room, ritual can be super helpful. Having some place to note these losses so to not pretend they're not happening, this sort of gaslighty thing. Just put it somewhere. And it doesn't take much, but note it somewhere, And then maybe on your way home from work, as you're washing this stuff out of you, remember that is a very difficult environment. You're asked to do nearly impossible things. Forgive yourself for what you couldn't get to. Let some feeling come back about that person you lost. And if it was something you wish you'd done differently, learn, and forgive. And then start again the next day, something like that. Or some version on that. Somewhere you got to stay real because you're being exaggerated in this distorted field of the ER. You've got to somehow re-expand into the world. And it can be 5 seconds of stepping outside on a break and looking at the sky. It can be your drive home, whatever. But you got to do it. You'll forget that a wider world exists.
I'm touched by your own mother's death. I know that within my mother's death, I have this belief that, and I wanted you to talk about what you've seen in it, that with all suffering, with all things, there's compensation nearby. And in the grief that I had, I found that there's this incredible beauty, and that beauty was the compensation. And I was just wondering, in your experience with working with people at this point, if you could speak a little bit about compensation nearby.
That's a beautiful notion. I love that notion. At first I thought you were talking money, like there was a lawsuit possible or something. I was like, wow, where's this guy going? But no, this notion that whatever your experience, however profound and consuming a feeling like grief can be, and it can be, as you know, all-consuming. But anything that reminds you, and I think this is what you're getting, anything that reminds you that it still isn't the whole picture, it's still not everything, and that everything is swirling, and life and death are inseparable, and loss and gain are related, and beauty and terror, all these things you don't get. So you start noting these dynamics, and then you have access to the compensation. And so I think whatever tells you that whatever you're feeling isn't everything, remember that, key into that. Does that kind of get at your question a little bit?
Yeah, I just was wondering if, in your experience, if you just speak of things that you've seen like that.
Oh, totally. Well, some real obvious ones around like, now that I've watched so many families, like now that I finally let myself have feelings, I realize I wish I had said I love you more. I wish I had, in this backdrop of loss and everything must go, it can be a quickening. And so you can see these gorgeous moments where a stoic man finally sheds a tear, or someone admits they had been wrong, or someone forgives. These are all, in my mind, big compensatory, beautiful counterpoints to, and you don't get them without the pain. That's part of the realization, is that's the ticket. You can't, And that realization and that fullness is it just gave me chills thinking about it. And you just remember, you don't get one without the other. And then it's just hard to hate your experience anymore. And I remember a version of this when I was injured. I had no idea how awesome my friends were. I had the most beautiful friends, and I didn't even know it because nothing had come along to poke us so they could reveal how compassionate they were, how loving they were, how accepting they were. They hadn't had an excuse to show that. And it took this to get that. And that seems like actually a pretty good deal, honestly. That seems like a pretty good deal. So versions like that play out all the time. And not always. There aren't all these bows on these situations. Or let's say the bow can be delayed. I've seen a lot of people, myself included. I lost my sister, and it was many years until I could even think about it or talk about it or realize some of the gifts that her death brought to me. And that was a very delayed response. So sometimes it's also a leap of faith, just knowing that these pain and pleasures exist, these joys and sorrows exist. It's a faith to know that there's joy out there. But if you know that, then you can be a little more patient. It'll come.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's make this the last one. Yeah.
I had two within one, so you can pick. It's the fire round. The one question is about if you see a lot of folks going. I hear about Switzerland having sort of different process, and if you see a lot of people leaving. And the second question is, you talk about one day you'll probably leave this work because of and I'm just wondering if you have a whiff of what that might be that you move to.
Well, so the first question, I have, it's not a lot of people that I've known who have considered going to Switzerland. And guys, just to bring you up to speed, like we were saying earlier, I think there's now 10 states in the U.S. that have these aid in dying laws on the books. They have their structural problems, like we were saying, the weight, like what happens if you have ALS and you can't physically lift the medicine and put it in your mouth, or you don't have a functioning stomach. The way the law is written, that's not allowed. So there are all these legal problems in this country around it. And I feel for the legislatures, it would be a very hard policy to write. And then you have to be terminal, So what happens in a place like Switzerland, there are a couple organizations there that basically take all comers. You don't have to be terminal. And so you can sidestep a lot of the sort of red tape hindrances. Of course, you got to fly to Switzerland, and it's something like $10,000. Never mind the travel. So it's a problem, but it's an escape valve that a lot of people, again, a lot of people I've talked to are just glad to know it exists. I don't know that I've met anybody who's actually done it. So, but I will say it's tricky. Canada is experimenting with a federal law that's much more permissive. Younger people, like, if I understand it correctly, they're either entertaining, like you don't have to even be 18, and you don't even have to have you can request hastening death for psychiatric illness, not typically thought of as terminal. And these open big old questions. And people are moving towards their death because they can't get housing. And there are slippery slopes. And so it gets really complicated. In some ways, as flawed as our state laws are, I'm glad there's some structure around, and maybe we can learn and develop an ethos to go along with these possibilities. It's not going to happen in a day. So I'm glad Switzerland has this thing out there that if you can afford it and want to do it, okay. But I don't see a lot of people using it. So, sorry, that's the first question. Second question, I think you already asked. Like, for me, this aesthetic domain I just freaking love it. So I would love, if we have our way, mental health the practice will grow and it can sustain us as a job. And that would be great. And then we can develop a sort of a second line of business where we create places to die, or affordable places to live if you're really sick and disabled. Universally designed architecture So I'd really love if I could segue into that creative work, is my answer to your question. We'll see. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, what a fabulous Q&A. I really enjoyed that.
You too, guys. Thank you so much.
BJ, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah. Here's to Maxine. Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. If you enjoyed the show, please hit that subscribe button, or even better, share it with a friend. Until next time, be well.